Welcome to the Unfiltered Autistic podcast, the podcast that aims to give an unfiltered account of autistic lived experiences. Created and hosted by me, Amanda McGuinness, an autistic autism and visual support specialist and parent to 4 neurodivergent children. You're welcome back to part 2 of my son's autism diagnosis. Thank you so much to everyone who joined me for last week's podcast and also for your patience waiting for this week's podcast. I found out very quickly that everyone wanted the part 2. I suppose the reality is when I'm speaking of my beautiful Conor, he is alive and well today, so I suppose the story continues, but in relation to his early years, I'll move on now from where I left off. So the last piece that I remember speaking about was in relation to leaving that particular Tesco that day, and I guess driving home thinking, how can it possibly be that people speak so unkindly of people that are different? I just couldn't fathom it. I'm actually quite glad that I didn't know that this was the way that life was going to now be, and that, even as I say it now, I can hear like a little kind of shake in my voice, that I didn't know that it was never going to end. This was now our new way of being, and I was devastated in every moment that it occurred, but it still occurs to this day. I could tell you multiple stories of even more recently, but maybe that's for a podcast for another day. But I suppose when I go back again in time, Conor's almost 15 today, but back in those years, he was just after turning 1. We now had a diagnosis of autism. We were now navigating a world where, for whatever reason or however this was possible, because this was long before I myself was really even on social media. I'm on social media now through multiple platforms, through Little Puddins and Amanda McGuinness platforms. But back in those days, I was just at home with my gorgeous Puddin Conor and my beautiful Puddin Hayley, and life just kind of went on. I continued to drive the roads. I continued to now, I had a word autism to research. I tried researching. I tried learning everything that I could. Unfortunately, the information in those days wasn't neuroaffirmative. It was more pathologized than what it is today. Thankfully, we've moved on greatly. Still lots more work to do, of course. But back in those days, I was picking up and reading books and ordering resources and ordering whatever I could. I was figuring it all out, but I didn't really know where to start, because it was all, as any parent will tell you, and as any autistic person who has been identified at any time in their lives, when you find out that you're autistic, or you realise that you're autistic, or your child, you find out that your child does realise that your child is autistic, even though it's great and fantastic to have that information, you're still starting at ground zero and you're going, but what now? Where's the right place to start, and what do I do now, and where do I start now, and where's the best place to start? And even today, I suppose, as an autism specialist speaking to families daily, the one thing that they'll always say is, I'm not sure where to start. And I always say, start at home. Start at home. Start where you are at home and do the best that you can at home. But back in those days, I didn't have anyone to help me, and I didn't have anyone that I could turn to that could really advise me. It was just me, myself, and many books that I started to accumulate, many of which live in my, I suppose, office today, and a shed that I actually had to buy to host or maybe hold many of the books, because I'm a great researcher, but I also am a great, I won't say the word hoarder because they are my passionate interest, a great keeper of things that are meaningful to me, and that having been all of my life, books and research. So I suppose when I go back in time again, my beautiful Conor now was over a years old. We're coming into the spring, I believe, of that year. I'm just thinking back to when that incident occurred outside the Tesco, and again, we were getting braver every day, but there was days and weeks and months where I wouldn't chance leaving the house because there might have been another unfortunate, unkind incident, or my beautiful Conor was just finding it all too overwhelming again. But what sticks out to me from that time was 2 of my friends in particular. They would have been, I suppose, my younger self friends, and they were actually sisters, Caroline and Emer. They're from Mayo as well. And interestingly, they both work in professions that support the public. So I think they had a deep understanding of empathy and just supporting others that are in need of help. 2 wonderful, I would call them ladies, but more so I'd call them excellent, incredible friends. But I do remember, even after Conor having his, identification or diagnosis of being autistic, his difficulties that he experienced in the world continued. I didn't yet have all the knowledge. I didn't understand home as the haven. I didn't understand what were pillars of the day. I didn't understand monotropism back in those days. There was so much that I didn't understand. I was starting out with limited material and knowledge bases available to me, just doing what I could, but not really knowing which was the key piece that I needed to know. So I feel terrible guilt when I think of it now. But I always say I wish I had the knowledge base back then that I have now, because even though I tried my absolute best, I'm sure I got things wrong. I'm positive that I did. And I always say I feel such immense guilt for that, because if I had the knowledge back then that I have now, maybe those difficult moments that my beautiful Conor experienced, maybe there wouldn't have been as many, because maybe I would have known exactly what I needed to do just right then when he needed his mom to be the best that she could be. So even, I suppose, when I say it now, I get a little lump in my throat, because I just think I wish I did know, but I suppose I didn't. But again, what kind of saved me in those days? And I always think of them. And my friend Caroline, she was actually training as a member of Garda Síochána at the time. She used to ring me from, she was on her way down from, oh my God, I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong. I'm going to say Tullamore, but I don't know if that's where the Garda Training College was. If you know me, you know I'm absolutely diabolical with geography. So it could be anywhere, but I feel like it was the word T was in the address of where she was coming from. But she would ring me, you know, before she left, before she was travelling, and she would ring and say, she used to call me Mandy, she still does. She would say, Mandy, where are you? And of course, she would ring to see was I on the road driving with my beautiful Conor somewhere in the countryside, driving along while he slept in the back. Day or night she would ring. And once a week, or I believe it was once every 2 weeks, once every week or once every 2 weeks, she would ring and say, I'm on the way down, have Hayley ready, get ready to get out of the house. And this incredible lady would come to my house, and I'm sure when she saw me, I'm sure I looked quite unusual, because again, I would have had no sleep for, gosh, I couldn't even imagine. It would have been so long at that point, but I would continue to have no sleep. My beautiful Conor, hopefully, and I hopefully can look back and reflect that he was sleeping, because if I was driving, he was sleeping. And if I was pushing him around the road, he was sleeping. But my lovely friend Caroline would come to the house and she would say, right, I'm here. I'll take Conor. And Conor, of course, who would find it very difficult for anyone to come into the house, would be screaming the house down, because he knew there was somebody different now at the door. There was someone different trying to come into the house. And he would begin screaming. And I would say, no, I wouldn't, Caroline. I'll stay with him now and mind him. No, you're okay. Just come in if you want to have tea. I'll get him to calm. It'll be okay. And she'd say, Mandy, I get to go home after this. You have to stay, and you'll have no sleep and you'll have no rest. She goes, give me the child, I won't leave. Give me the baby. You leave the house with Hayley. You and Hayley need a break, because my husband at that time was working. So it was just me, myself and Hayley and Conor struggling on every day. So like, for example, when Conor was small, we'd say if Caroline wasn't visiting during the day, when she would be down from Dublin, or if Emer, her sister, another incredible human being, didn't pop in for a visit. She was a young person at that point, you know, in school. But like, would I say late teen, maybe she correct me now, I could be wrong. I'm going to say either very, very late teens or very exceptionally early 20s. She would come in to see me, and she would again do the same as Caroline would do. She would take, I was with the baby, she would take my beautiful Conor and tell me to get out of the house and get a break. But anyway, Caroline would come in, but would say, before she would have visited, like my husband was working, I was on my own with Hayley. I couldn't leave the house because Conor would find it too difficult at different times during his life. And for example, this was the level of support that Conor required, that if I needed, this is the truth, if I needed to go to the toilet, I would have to bring Conor with me. Hayley was still very young. She was under 2. I'd have to bring Hayley with, no, I tell a lie. I think she was about 2 at that point. At this age that he was, yeah, she might have been around 2. I'd bring Hayley with me, bring Conor with me. I'd have to put Conor literally on the mat on the ground, because again, he couldn't hold much weight even at that point. Lay him on the ground, use the toilet, wash my hands, flush the toilet, wash my hands. Encourage Hayley, to be okay about the fact we were all in the toilet, but that ultimately she would get, I suppose, afraid that if I wasn't with her, I suppose she was anxious around that time as well. So we'd all leave again, and while he'd be screaming and crying, she made up this song, and I can't remember, this was the song, again, I'm not going to sing it, you'll be blessed to know, but she would sing this song with her little baby voice. She would go, windies, windies, go, 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 windies, windies, no, 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 because I used to tell her the screaming was because he had lots of wind, because before beautiful Conor was born, I suppose she had her own happy little life. She still had her happy little life, but it was definitely, I suppose, as it happens when you're an only child, she had a very peaceful little life, and now she had this gorgeous little brother, but he was experiencing many of the difficulties, and one of which was, I suppose, anxiety, among other things, and he would scream quite a lot at a very high-pitched scream. But I always remember that song and her just covering her little hands over ears singing the song. But then when Caroline would come, I'm sure I looked absolutely atrocious, but she never let me know that I did. She was always super kind. She would say, now Mandy, I'm here, give me the baby, and away you go. and she would always get Hayley like a little present or a voucher from some shop. She goes, now that's for Hayley. Take her off down there now and get her something nice and get yourself a cup of tea and don't come back. I'll be here for 2 hours. Don't come back. And she's saying, if you do come back, you won't be coming inside the door. So you'll have to go again. So I would do that religiously. Anytime this poor lady that was studying to be a member of An Garda Síochána would come down all the way just to let me loose for a couple of hours once or twice a week. If Granny Golden wasn't available, or, I suppose my husband at the time was working. So essentially it was just me, myself, and my beautiful Hayley and Conor. But I always remember that. Or my lovely friend, her sister Emer, would come, and this would be more summertime at this point, and we would go walking around the roads, the ring roads of Castlebar. I suppose they probably could all see that my mental health was struggling even then. And I remember she used to bring us out just for a walk, and she'd say, come on now, it doesn't matter if he's crying, I'll help you, and I'll help Hayley. And Hayley used to sit in the front. I think I have a picture of her somewhere with these sunglasses on. Conor, I am sure, was in the back screaming, and we just walked along the ring road because nobody can hear us. You're on the ring road, sure, who can hear us? It doesn't matter who's screaming, let's keep going. And it would get me out of the house again another day of the week. So I always be so, I suppose, thankful for their help. But I suppose the message in me sharing that story is not for anyone to feel sorry or think, God, wasn't it terrible or wasn't hard? Yeah, it was incredibly hard. But the message is that if you're a family member of a parent of a child that is struggling, or, that needs extra support, if you are a friend, if you are, somebody that could help, always call in and always check, because you don't know, I suppose, really what difference that will make to the person. So if you can, do call in, don't forget to text, don't forget to call, because I suppose that's one of the things that did happen after my beautiful Conor was born, was that the general friends that I have, and I call them general now because they all kind of disappeared after my beautiful Conor was born. They faded away because I suppose, one, people didn't really know, I suppose they couldn't really visit because Conor found it a little bit difficult, probably quite difficult, but also I suppose really they didn't really know what to do after, I suppose, for whatever reason, this information about Conor was, at that point, such public knowledge before I even understood it myself, that lots of people seemed to know that I had a beautiful child. That back in those days, the language was had special needs. But again, that's not language I would use, but that was the language of those times. It was 15 years ago almost. But all of those friends disappeared and everyone else went on with their lives. And then at this point, I think this is a little bit later on, I eventually say within a number of years joined the likes of Facebook at the time. And I would see people out and about living their lives, seeing people that used to visit me now visiting other people, because in those days people had put up a snap if they had a cup of tea somewhere. So all these snaps would go up and you'd see them and you just think, gosh, I used to live a life like that and I used to do things like that. And God, I wish would they visit me? But obviously, I wasn't reaching out to these people either. So it wasn't that they were these horrendously unkind people, just life moved on for them. But my life, in a way, was kind of standing still because I was trying to do all of this researching and all of this learning. But all the while I had a child with, I suppose what he still has today, with high support needs that really required my help. But I didn't yet have the skill set or the knowledge base that I would have today to support him. So I really was, I suppose, drowning in knowledge and drowning in trying to figure out which was the right thing to do this time. So I suppose life continued like that for a while. And unfortunately, we would have had multiple other unkind incidents, which I won't repeat here because it's not that I want people to feel sorry, but just more to say that this was kind of the narrative. And this isn't isolated to me or my beautiful family. This is what goes on in today's world in 2024. This is what's probably going on somewhere in Ireland right now to somebody or somebody you've passed in the street that is having these, difficulties that nobody else maybe knows about, or that feels very isolated because they have no support. So really, I suppose that's the point of this podcast, is to lift that veil, to let you know that these things do happen. I'm incredibly privileged to have a platform where I can go onto my own tiny podcast and tell people about this was my life, or this is my life in different areas, I suppose, even to this day. But I have the capacity to be able to tell these stories, but I'm not telling these stories for sympathy. I'm telling these stories so that perhaps you might think twice if you have a friend that maybe you haven't heard from in a while, but you do know that they had a baby, whether the child has high support needs or not, whether the child is autistic or not, is neurodivergent or not. Check in, ask, check in on your friends and see how they are. If you can, a quick text, a quick call, a quick message on a social media platform, they'll feel so thankful and feel less isolated and invisible. But I suppose that's what I always think about Caroline and Emer. But the story with Caroline and Emer doesn't finish there. A number of years later, their incredible brother Christopher came along, and actually my gorgeous Jack takes his second name from Christopher. So at this point now, my gorgeous Conor was older, a little bit older. He was now, I'm going to say he probably would be around 1.5, 2 at this point. So he was getting a good bit older. And at that time, back in those days, there was a scheme where you could collect phones to get an iPad. And I know everyone's like, oh, I should just go out and buy an iPad. But I'd given up my law career at this point. And the company that my husband had worked for, this is when the crash of the economy had come, had closed. So now suddenly we were both, I suppose, in a sense, under pressure financially, because I could no longer work in a very well paid, I suppose, career in the law sector, the legal sector. And his role in where he had worked had finished up, and he was, I suppose, actively looking for work. So we were in dire straits. But we also knew that we needed to get an iPad to support Conor with his communication and different pieces. But we also knew that it was incredibly difficult for us at that point, because, you know, I couldn't work. I would have been, I suppose, the most established of the two of us to earn the most, but I couldn't work because I was, I suppose, essentially the person that needed to be there most with my beautiful Conor. But I remember mentioning this in passing. I don't know where I met Christopher. Maybe I'd said it to Caroline in one of her visits, or one of my calls I would have had with her on loudspeaker, of course, when I would be driving along on the road and on my, I suppose, long journeys with Conor. But I must have said in passing, oh, you had to collect, and this is many, many years ago, so I don't think the scheme exists anymore. There was a different charity around at the time where you could do this. I think it was like maybe you had to collect 150 phones or something and you would get an iPad. And I thought, this is great, this will help my Conor. And it really actually did. But I'd forgotten all about it. And then one day I got this call, and this lovely gentleman, Christopher, who again was a very young person at the time, came to the door, and he had, I'm not even joking, he had the 150 or 250, whatever it was, these phones. And he said, I collected all of these for Conor so he could get his iPad. And I remember just being like, oh my God, the kindness of this one family is just, even now, as I say, because I forget about it, not that I forget about it, but you forget about the feeling that you had that somebody went out of their way to help you when you needed it. And I always just remember thinking, and I didn't know yet, that I suppose that one day I would have my beautiful Jack, and that if I did, I always remember saying to Caroline, you know, if I ever have, you know, another child, if I'm lucky enough to have another child, I'm definitely going to name him after Christopher. And I suppose everyone had forgotten, but lucky as it was, one day I did have a lovely little boy called Jack, and his second name is Christopher. So I always just think about that and how lucky we were, I suppose, to have met this wonderful family, I suppose, when I was a good bit younger, before I had children. So I suppose the purpose of that story is not to tell everyone, if they know somebody called Christopher, to go around collecting phones, but just to think all of those little kindness, that moment of, I wonder, could I help another person? Like, it makes such a difference. And it made such a difference, most importantly, to my most beautiful Conor, because his eyes lit up when he had his little iPad. Obviously, I went back to work years later and everything was fine. But I suppose in that particular moment, when we were really struggling, that's what we needed. We needed some person just to say, look, this family needs help. And they really did help us, and I never forgot it. And I suppose when I think of it now, that's how Jack has his name, Jack Christopher. So a big thanks to Christopher. But I suppose life then at that point was continuing on. My gorgeous Conor was still struggling to sleep. We were still doing the best we could. I was learning more now by the minute about autism, because I suppose the way that I am as an autistic person is that once I need to learn something, I just need to learn to get it. If you could just tell me where to start, then my mind goes into overdrive. I suppose I'm ADHD as well, so that helps. So I go into overdrive, and then because I have a photographic memory, I can retain what I see. And then I suppose as an autistic person, that monotropic thinking and that quick association of, I suppose, way to really process information, I could start making all of the quick fire associations around autism and the differences. I could factor out the pieces I was reading that was really, I suppose, pathologized, really negative, the really negative representation of autism or autistic experience. What I could see, though, what I could understand, was my own son. And what I really took from lots of those early days of researching was visual processing strengths. And the more I thought about my own son and how he did seem to have a photographic memory from what I could understand, and it reminded me a lot of myself. But again, the books in those days were saying, inverted commas, and again, this isn't the language that I would use, but it's the language that was in the text at that time, is that only boys have autism. That it's not my language, it's just the language that was in the books. And I remember saying, well, I couldn't be autistic because, you know, I'm a lady and I've had my children. And this was my thinking, I suppose, 15 years ago. Well, I suppose a little bit older now, Conor would have been. So I'm going to say 14, maybe 13 and a half years ago. And I just remember thinking, well, this couldn't possibly be me, but it's definitely my son Conor. And that, I suppose, triggered my interest in visual supports, and also because I think so quickly visually. But that's not a conversation I would have had with anyone, by the way, do you think visually? Because nobody's going to say yes or no. They're just going to be like, why are you asking me? But well, actually, if I asked another autistic person, they'd be like, well, I actually do. I'd have a great conversation with that person. But again, I did have a really strong understanding of how to support my son visually. I didn't know why I did, but I knew that I did. So that set me off on the path of what has led me today, I suppose, to be referred to as a visual support specialist. So that's, I suppose, well over a decade, almost, I suppose, 15 years of designing visual supports. And I suppose that's what first set me off then in supporting my son, is that I started to design visual supports, and I started to see a positive impact or positive change for Conor, in that he seemed to be a little less afraid if I could just communicate with him as to what he needed or what was to happen next. At that point, we were starting to get some services. Again, unfortunately, unlike today, fortunately, unlike today, back in those days, there were more supports available. We were working with a wonderful organisation in those early days. They were fantastic. They're absolute best for us. We were very lucky with all the people we worked with, primarily. Unlike today, where I suppose with my three sons, there's very few resources available to any of my sons. If I can't do it myself, then it doesn't happen. So I train and learn as much as I can all of the time for each of my gorgeous boys to support them. But I suppose what happened next, or the biggest turning point that came from us then, it would have been a number of more years while life continued on. My beautiful Conor was eventually prescribed a medication, which I won't reference here because, again, I'm not a medical health professional. I'm not going to be recommending any types of medication for anyone on a podcast. But again, check in with your GP or your paediatric consultant around medications for support with sleep. But my son was eventually prescribed a medication to support his sleep, and it really did support his sleep. So I remember the very first night, Conor, at this point, I'm going to say it was about 2.5, maybe 3. I'm going to say 2.5. I remember Conor, it was his first night being prescribed this medication. I remember I used to be up at night time researching and learning all of these, I would call random skills, but they came in very useful. I'm going to give an example in a moment as to one of those useful skills that I wouldn't have learned but for the fact my beautiful Conor didn't sleep at night time. So Conor was eventually prescribed a medication. The very first night he got it, myself and my husband at the time actually thought he had passed away, because we had never had a night where Conor slept through the night. He slept through the night, and we were both wide awake all night, because I was getting ready to, when was I going to leave to go driving? So I was waiting, when do I drive, and when should I, don't want to fall asleep because I'll be too tired to drive, or will I just call Conor Connie as well, will I push Connie around the house, what will I do? But eventually he slept all night. When he woke in the morning, he was like a brand new child. It was his first ever sleep, and I mean, I don't say that like flippantly, it was his first ever sleep until about 2.5 years of age. And we both thought, something terrible had happened because he'd slept, because we hadn't had that experience. Any of us in the house. Was Hayley did, she was always going to sleep as usual, but as adults we hadn't had that experience, and yet he slept the whole night. And again, it wasn't that every night he slept after that, because he didn't, because again, it's not magic, but he did start to sleep. So I didn't have to really drive as much anymore. He might not sleep a full night, but he might sleep a little while in a cot, and that meant then I could now sleep a little while myself. So life, in a way, started to pick up more positively. I had a better understanding of autism, not the understanding I have today, but I did have a very fast and very deep dive into autism. Thank you to monotropism for that. But again, I was able to really pick up all the knowledge. I was learning loads. I was understanding visual supports. I was designing, because I had still had lots of time to be awake at night time. But now Conor was a little bit older, so he would happily sit up on the couch and watch a cartoon or two himself while I was doing something else. Generally, I was researching or learning something. And many of the skills that I learned during those years helped me to help my son. I remember one of those things that Conor found really difficult at that time was to understand how to say his own name. Not how to say his own name, but how to understand that when I was saying his name, that it was his name. But again, I didn't understand, we'll say, passionate interest back then. I was starting to understand visual supports. I did have a better understanding of his sensory processing preferences, but I didn't really understand sensory processing, but I did know that he liked felt. But what I didn't know initially was how to understand Portuguese. This is going to sound very strange, but it is true, and anyone that knows me will tell you that the sign that I made exists to this day. I remember I was trying to teach Conor that his name was Conor, and I could see, again, he didn't become formally identified as having an intellectual disability for a number more years, but it was obviously still in existence. And I remember I wanted to teach him his name, and I couldn't figure out how could I teach him his name, but I knew he loved Angry Birds even when he was little. I think it was the noise the little red bird used to make. I won't attempt to make it now, this you'll be thankful to know. But I remember I was trying to support him to understand his name, and I decided that if I could learn how to make the name Conor out of felt, include the little angry birds, then I could help him to know that this was his name. And again, back in those days, I'm still not great, as you can tell by the podcast, I'm not particularly tech savvy, but I did know that if I could understand Portuguese, there's a reason for the mention of Portuguese twice now. If I could understand Portuguese, then I could follow these incredible Brazilian crafters on YouTube. Now, on YouTube at the time, there probably was a button where you just hit translate, but I was so exhausted from years of no sleep, I just couldn't see it, or if it maybe didn't exist back, I suppose, 13 years ago. So I decided then that if I could just learn Portuguese, I could understand what these incredible lady crafters were saying on their channel on YouTube, and then I too could make a felt sign for my beautiful Conor. So that's what I did. I got a Portuguese dictionary because I have a photographic memory that also includes like video clip type retention of memories, if that makes sense. And I can just recall it. Well, now it would be a bit rusty because I'm a bit older and haven't really been concentrating on Portuguese in the years since. But I went along and I would watch the videos, what they were saying and the words they were saying. Then I would look it up quickly. And I had this little yellow dictionary with Portuguese, and I would learn very quickly the words that they were saying. I'd match them to the dictionary. I'd continue to listen. I'd match them to the dictionary, continue and watch. And within a few days, I could understand what they were saying without the translations and without the dictionary. And I learned then how to make his name out of felt. Now, there might be a picture somewhere, perhaps on maybe on one of my highlights, on one of my stories somewhere, but it does exist somewhere on my social media. I'm sure I would have put up a picture because it still exists to this day. But I made his name out of I made his name out of felt, and I hung it above his bed, and I had all little Angry Birds all over it. And every morning and every night when my beautiful Conor would sleep, I would go through each of the letters with him, and each letter I would touch his beautiful chest, and I would spell Conor. Conor. I would say, your name is Conor, and I would sound out the letters phonetically because I wasn't sure receptively what was he understanding or what would he potentially be able to say, because even in those early days, I suppose after he'd stopped speaking, he wasn't making really many sounds now at all. But it took a little bit of time, but eventually he would look up at his little sign and he would look at me and he would try to say the Conor, and then he would touch his little heart and I would look at me as if to say, yeah, Mom, I'm Conor. And I'd be like, yes, you are Conor. So that's how I taught him his name, was because my beautiful Conor was awake at night time. I could then go away and again watch random, I suppose, webinar versions 13 years ago of people speaking Portuguese, creating designs that I thought I could possibly make that for my son if I could figure out what they were saying. So I did. I taught myself Portuguese so I could make that sign for my son, and that's how he learned his name. So that's where we were then. I was upskilling very quickly. My beautiful Hayley was settling into her new school out in kind of a country area in Mayo, and we eventually moved out to that area, and that's where I suppose our family story took another positive turn. And we moved in beside a wonderful family that have they had quite a large family actually, but they were incredibly kind to my beautiful Conor. The dad that was there taught me how to cut my son's hair. The mom was working with people with disabilities. I learned so much from her, and their own children were just so compassionate and so kind. If they called to the door for Hayley, they would call for Conor. Now, where we lived at the time, it was a beautiful area, but it was quite a very busy and a dangerous area in the sense of near a road. So Conor couldn't often pop out, but they would pop out the back of our house. I remember feeling for the first time ever how included Conor was, because they would come over because we would have swings and all the things out the back, nothing major, nothing fancy, but just a few bits for the kids. And they would come out and come over. They lived next door. They would pop over and come out the back playing. And I remember I used to feel like, I'm sure I looked like the neighbour that was always crying, because I am a crier, but I remember I'd nearly be crying saying, look, Conor, he has friends and he's playing, and Hayley's can have friends over. And I always was very careful who came into the house, because I didn't want anyone to ever, I suppose still to this day I'm the same, I never wanted anyone to make Conor feel less for being different. I didn't understand, we'll say, the neurodiversity paradigm like I do now. I didn't understand neurodivergent or neurotypical like I do now. I didn't have the knowledge base back then like I do now, but I did understand that my beautiful son was a human being, and he deserved to never feel less for the basic fact that he was different. And our lovely neighbours, they were so incredibly kind to us, so incredibly kind. The mom, the dad, the children, so lovely. And they would just pop out the back, chat away, play with Conor. If they had treats for Hayley, they had treats for Conor. They never left him out. And I remember thinking that was the first time I'd ever seen any other human being. I suppose we didn't really have that opportunity to go out to any other place really, but our home was our haven then, it is our haven now. But I remember thinking that was another turning point. I think of all the paths and all the roads we've taken in all these years, but everything think there was always a turning point. And I would have always said to myself then, as I would now, I would always say, in a year from now, I look back and see how far I have come, or see how far my beautiful Conor has come. And even at that point, I could look back and see that actually, okay, we faced some incredibly difficult times, but actually we faced some incredibly brilliant times as well. He now has friends, he's lovely neighbours, they're really kind to him. Myself as a mother, I have a next door neighbour who's a wonderful lady I can speak to about my son, the father that lived next door, the dad that lived next door. Like, if he hadn't shown me how to cut my Conor's hair, I suppose all my boys would have very long hair today, because I know for sure they wouldn't be going into too many barbers. They'd find it too tricky. So I'm incredibly thankful to those people. But again, that's what I talk about. And that's the point of the podcast, lifting back that veil. What if I hadn't moved there? What if I hadn't met that family? What if I didn't have my incredible friends, Caroline Emer and the brother Chris, all of these people that played a role? What if I didn't have my incredible mother-in-law, my incredible brothers and sisters and dad and all of our family members? Like, all of these people played a role. And that's why I say, if you're listening to the podcast as a person that, doesn't have any direct link, but maybe has a neighbour, or maybe has, extended family member, send a text message, call in, or maybe don't drop in because it might be upsetting for the autistic person, but maybe arrange that would be possible to meet somewhere just to have a cup of tea. Is there anything that you need? Is there anything that you can do? Because as beautiful as it is for any family to have a child that is unique, it also brings challenges, not the child, but society. It's nearly like your beautiful child arrives and then all of these unexpected challenges come in the door from society, not from your child. Your child is your incredible human being that is so loved and so wanted. But it's suddenly all of these challenges and unexpected moments. Or as I would have said back in those days, I lived a life unexpected. I never knew what was going to happen next. All of these challenges come to the door, not all of the time, but sometimes when you live in a world that isn't so accepting of difference, these things do come to the door. And most of them are unexpected, because nobody expects, like I didn't expect, that somebody would talk so unkindly about my son, that would exclude my children, or say really not so nice things, or I couldn't even list them all now. But I suppose that's what the point of the podcast is, that if you are listening, reach out to people and check in and ask, are they okay? And is there anything that you can do? And it doesn't have to be a big anything that you can do. It could just be, do you need me to nip to the shop for you? Because I couldn't have gone to the shop on those days, say if Caroline didn't drop in. I wouldn't have attempted to go out walking with Hayley and Conor on a hot summer day without Emer with me, because I just felt so exhausted and so overwhelmed back in those days. But I suppose the next major turning point that came for Conor during his autism diagnosis, this is all in the early years, is that he started in the most fabulous early years class, in the most incredible, I suppose I'm biased because I do think it is incredible, probably one of the most, if not the most incredible autism classes in the county of Mayo, and that's in Knockruski National School, where on my very first day I met the most outstanding principal, Mr. Kieran Gertie. And I've been very lucky in that all of my children, all of my boys have gone to Knockruski. Hayley had been attending a different school before Conor went to Knockruski for the autism class. So if Hayley had started in school after Conor, she would have gone to Knockruski to the mainstream, because it was just such a fabulous school. And I always remember that first day walking into the school and just seeing, I think that morning I had seen Kieran out directing all of the children safely across the road. We went in to visit the school. There was no closed doors, as in every room was open, as in you could go in to visit every classroom. He wanted you to see his fabulous school, but he wanted you to see that it was a school about inclusion. There was no barriers. There was no visible or invisible barriers there. Everybody belonged. Everyone had a place. Everyone had a voice. And that has always been the way of Knockruski. That's always been my experience as a parent. I've always been blown away, I suppose, by what was being achieved all those years ago by a beautiful school in County Mayo that I now see happening across all of the counties of Mayo. But back in those days, I would definitely, without fail, say, in my opinion, that Kieran Gertie, the principal there, was thought leader, and all of his incredible staff and outstanding SNAs. I always say that was really when everything started to change for the better. It wasn't just me on my own hoping for maybe more services. Now we had an incredible school. We had fantastic staff. We had incredible SNAs. I had a principal I could place a call to, ask a question to. All of those things made a difference. A highly educated team of professionals that understood autism in the way that I understand autism to this day, but they understood it back then when I was just learning. I always will remember that. And I just remember Conor starting, and I have a little photo of him somewhere, on me dropping him to school on his first day, just for his, that visit that they have in the June, and the little smile on his face when I picked him up. I'm sure I cried then as well. I'm always crying. But I remember just thinking, oh, how beautiful for my lovely Conor. And he started to come on in leaps and bounds from that point on. I really did see it. I suppose where I am now in the story is that now Conor had started school, things started to really pick up for Conor. But I suppose just before he had started in Knockruski, we had tried out with, say, an early year setting for Conor. And that would have been the only other time in my life, the last time in my life before Knockruski, where I trusted any other human being with my beautiful Conor. Now, I won't go into the particulars of the setting or anything like that, but I remember going into, it was more of an activity than a setting, an activity that was, I suppose, advertised as for all children. And we had a person working with my beautiful Conor. Again, it wouldn't have been placed there by ourselves, but it was a person that just, through, I suppose, a government agency had been working with my lovely Conor. And I remember, I suppose this goes back to how we speak to parents and how we talk to parents and what we say to parents as professionals. It's so important. I know my own dad would have said to me all of my life, and to all of us growing up, like, you really need to be careful with your words, because you can never really know how they may fall upon a person. And I'm sure the words that this particular individual spoke to me, they didn't mean it in the way that it landed. But I suppose I was a parent that just before Conor had, I suppose, enrolled in Knockruski for starting in his early year setting, we had tried Conor just in a mainstream activity. And I remember trying to speak to the lady one day. There was some difficulties in the supports for Conor. And, I was very worried and no doubt probably overwhelmed. And I remember saying to the lady, could we just try X or could we just try Y? Because I suppose they were the supports being recommended by the professional. And this person, I would have been an external person supporting Conor in this particular activity. And they had just said, this is literally what they said. They just said that I needed to, and now, please forgive me, but this is what they said. So I'm just repeating what was said to me at the time. So forgive me, but this is what was said. They said, you just need to pull up your big girl knickers now and X, Y, and Z about whatever it was that I had been asking her to do. And then I just remember feeling so scared, because then I thought, oh my gosh, if I say anything else to this person, they may not support my beautiful Conor, and then they may not be able to attend this activity. And then what happens? And then what happens? And that's where I had a little fear that kind of started then about having anyone working with my beautiful Conor. Now, a number of other things happened later with this individual, and I eventually removed Conor from this person's care, and I'm glad that I did. But again, I suppose sometimes it comes down to perhaps maybe not having enough training or having the right training or whatever it is the person needed. But it was very, 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 very upsetting, and it made me so scared about who I would have, supporting my Conor. Now, this is again years and years and years and years ago when Conor was a tiny infant. But again, I was very, very glad then when it was actually, I remember it was Conor's incredible paediatric consultant, the lady that would have identified Conor, that I remember going to her the summer before I enrolled Conor in Knockruski. And I remember saying to her, this would have been after this incident, in this particular activity, where this person would have said those really, oh my God, unkind words to me as a parent. And again, that's the message. Be so careful with your words, because we don't know the impact. We don't know the lives that all of these incredible families are leading. I do, because it's my life every day. But for these families that you are supporting, whether as a professional, whether as a family member, you cannot know the true extent to how they're being treated every day of their lives, how people are so dismissive of who they are as a carer, as a parent, as a sibling, as the autistic person. We cannot know. So every word that we say, we really do need to be careful, because we don't know that impact. I was very lucky in that I could go home, talk to my husband, I could talk to my families, to my parents, to my own siblings, to, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law. I could tell people about how I was feeling about it, but there's people that have nobody to turn to. So that's why I say to be so careful. But I remember after that incident speaking to Conor's paediatric consultant, an incredible individual, and I said, where would be the place for my beautiful Conor? Do you think would be the right place? Because I was so unsure, especially after what had happened for Conor in that activity. And the lady said to me that, that for her, the best place that she knew of that she would recommend was Knockruski. So that kind of set us off in the right direction. And that's where my beautiful Conor went. And as I say, from that moment on for Conor, everything in life really did start to pick up, because now I was upskilling very quickly. I was learning very fast. The school were so incredibly supportive. There was never a moment where if I didn't or couldn't, as I say, figure it out for myself, I now knew who I could call immediately, and they always had the answer. And it was just, and you know what I thought was the loveliest? This will tell you how, I suppose, differently the world was back then, where it wouldn't happen today. But I remember thinking, I wonder, there was going to be a school play. And for whatever reason, this was my own, like nobody had suggested this. I just thought this because my son was officially different because he was officially diagnosed as different. I had this, or maybe it wasn't my thought, maybe it's what I was reading was happening in other locations, and I was afraid that this was going to be our experience as well. But I remember thinking there was going to be a Christmas play in Conor's school. I remember thinking, God, I would have loved if Conor could have had a moment and been at a Christmas play. I would have loved that for Conor. But I remember just thinking, well, with the way the world was back then, it would have been more common than uncommon, or at least with the people I was communicating with, for children that were like my beautiful Conor, they might not have had those opportunities to maybe be part of a whole school play. But I remember thinking it wouldn't have been lovely if my lovely Conor would have had that opportunity. And lo and behold, he did. It was, I don't know why I didn't think he would, but I remember getting the call from his teacher asking, could I get Conor, sorry, laughing at thinking about it, could I get Conor a camel costume, that he was going to be a camel in the nativity. And I just burst out crying, and I was like, I would get that for him. I remember racing to town so excited, because you might think that was a silly thing to cry about, but when you faced in his short little life, when you faced so much exclusion, that to think that he was, of course, why wouldn't he, of course, isn't he a student, wouldn't he be included if he'd like to be, wouldn't he be on the stage, that I'm sure the teacher with such a gentle soul was thinking, this lady is always crying. I'm sure I was, but it was because we had been excluded and turned away, I suppose, so much. And I mean, outside the context of his incredible school, so many other times. I remember they had a practice play in the school for the little ones that might have found, the main play on the stage that particular year in Westport at the Christmas time, say, play. So they had the in-school one, and then they had on the main stage of an evening. And I remember the day I walked into the school and saw him as a camel, and he was with his fantastic SNA, I believe her name was Jenny at the time, sorry, I'm going to say young person, I call everyone young, I feel like I'm 90, an incredible lady, an incredible SNA, minding him and looking after him and supporting him. And I remember just seeing him there, because he loves music, he loved the music. And I remember just being like, I remember saying, this is what life is. Haley was so happy, Haley was with me, Granda, my husband was there, and grannies, everyone was there. We were all so happy, because remember, you might think, well, of course he would have been in the play, but that isn't always the case, unfortunately. And I know we're talking about a play, but more broadly, if you've had an experience, at this point, Conor was 4, almost 5, if you've had almost 4 years of, in different ways, exclusion, in different ways being turned away from things, in different ways essentially being shunned because your child is different, or being different ways laughed at, or words said that you couldn't imagine a human saying, but they're being said to your little human, or about your little human, then you can imagine why you might just assume, well, there'll be no play for my lovely Conor. But actually there was. He was a camel. Sorry, I just laugh because I remember crying buying the costume. I'm sure the lady at the shop was like, that lady really likes camels. So I was buying the costume, but I was just so like, I can't believe I get to buy him a costume. And then the next lovely thing that happened that particular year was, after the Christmas play in the school, a number of nights later, there was a Christmas play on in the main hall in the Westport town, belonged to Conor's school. So all his classmates were there, and, Conor was obviously going to be on stage, and my mother and my dad and my sisters and brothers, anyone that could come came, and my husband's family came, we all came, anyone that could come came. And Conor was on the main stage, but I remember walking in, holding Conor's hand, because of course I'm still, as I mentioned, geography is not my forte, neither is directions. I was trying to find my way into the hall. And a student, I'm going to say might have been in 5th or 6th class, goes, "Hi Conor, do you want me to bring Conor down to the hall?" And I said, "Oh, do you know Conor?" He goes, "Yeah, I see Conor in the playground, like the school playground. I play with Conor all the time." And he goes, "Come on, Conor, I'll show you." And off he walked with my lovely Conor into the main hall, getting ready to go on stage. And he did go on stage. And I remember, of course, where this ends, I was crying again. But I was crying because I remember thinking, this is the stuff of dreams. It shouldn't be the stuff of dreams. We should just expect that all of our children, of course, they should all be on every stage. But it was just a given in Knockruski. Of course, why wouldn't he be on the stage? Isn't he a student here in the school? Wouldn't he? If he'd like to be, we'd love to have him. And he was just part, immediately, he was part of the school fabric. And I always just think that was the first time in my life, once Conor started there, that everything really, it was like everything took off then at momentum, because now I had the time to really focus and study, autism, really understand what I was doing. He was in the most supportive environment, had the most incredible principal, the most incredible teachers and SNAs, the most wonderful, I suppose, fellow students that just embraced him for who he was, but embraced each other and all the students for who they were. So I always remember that moment as life is going to get better. I had that strong feeling of life is going to get better now. Of course, there was many more tricky moments for my beautiful Conor, but I suppose that was where I suppose things really took off for the better for my lovely Conor. Now I see I'm at nearly 3/4 of an hour, so I'm going to stop. But I suppose as regards my beautiful Conor's autism diagnosis, I could tell you lots of other things and lots of more pieces of information. But I hope that the pieces that I have talked to you about today, they weren't to make you feel sorry for me or to feel a certain way, but I hope they will empower you to see that having a child that's autistic is not a terrible thing. It's a great thing to understand your child from a very early age. It's a great thing to know that you're autistic. It's a great thing to have a family that embrace and support you for who you are. It's an incredible thing to have a school that embrace difference and from the top down, because that's what I see when I see Knockruski from the top down. It's total inclusion. It's understanding and acceptance of difference from the top down. It's so, I cannot tell you, it's breathtaking to see. I suppose if you're a family member, a friend, an extended family member, someone, a neighbour, if there's anything that you can do, just check in with a family. Ask if there's anything that you can do. You only need to switch on the news of a day to see, carers doing their best, advocating for just basic human rights. Asking for school places, asking for supports. Can you imagine if that was a moment of your life that you've spent the X amount of your child's life advocating for their basic human rights just to exist on the planet in a way that's safe for them to exist, for them to be able to access the curriculum, to go to the school place, to have a place in society where they belong, where they don't have to be chosen or lucky enough that they belong, because just like everybody else, they're incredible human beings who have a right and a reason to be where they are in the world today. So thank you for listening. That would be the end of, I suppose, part 1 and now part 2 of Conor's, I suppose, autism diagnosis. I hope it was, I suppose, I don't want to say not boring, but I hope it was interesting in the fact that it might spur you on to do something positive, to be a change maker and to make a positive difference for someone in your life or someone along your life's journey that you can support, or that you might stand up for someone in society where you see them maybe being excluded or something happening that you don't agree with because you know to your core it's wrong, to advocate, support those that need the support most. So thank you for listening, and check back next Monday for the next podcast. Thank you. Goodbye.